Welcome to SCDM's AI and eSource podcast series. My name is Nechama Katan, and I am the SCDM member for the eSource Implementation Consortium, who's going to be doing the interview today. The consortium's mission is to advance the adoption of eSource in clinical research. The use of artificial intelligence in its many forms, whether generative AI, agentic AI, machine learning, natural language processing, large language models, or GPT, has the potential to increase eSource adoption through the most effective implementation processes, documentation, training, validation, etc. This podcast series will talk with folks using AI and eSource from multiple clinical research perspectives, site sponsors, and technology vendors. Our guest today is Ellis Hiroki Buttefield. Ellis is the Chief Technology Officer of Cetero LLC, a technology-enabled clinical research organization based in Miami, Florida. He joined Cetero following the company's acquisition of StudyOS, where he had served as a co-founder and CEO. StudyOS was the creator of ASH, the AI clinical trial agent, and the acquisition marked a key milestone in Cetero's mission to deeply integrate advanced AI technology with clinical research operations. In his role as CTO, Ellis oversees technology strategy and the integration of ASH into Cetero's eClinical cloud. His career spans over a decade of experience in technology and entrepreneurship, including a role as a product manager at Microsoft, as well as the co-founding of multiple ventures. He holds a passion for leveraging artificial intelligence to streamline clinical trial workflows and improve outcomes for sponsors and patients alike. Welcome, Ellis.
Thank you for having me.
So just a quick SCDM disclaimer before we get started. This podcast is provided by the Society of Clinical Data Management, SCDM, eSource Implementation Consortium. It is intended for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal, regulatory, or professional advice. SCDM and the speakers are not responsible for any actions taken based on the information provided. Users are advised to consult with the appropriate professionals for specific advice tailored to their individual circumstances. The opinions expressed are attributed to the speakers only and not the respective employers. So let's get started. And so before we dive into AI, could you start by sharing what area of eSource you focus on the most? For example, eCOA, EHR, EDC integrations, digital health technology, wearables, etc., digital protocols, monitoring, end-to-end data flows, eSource training, and analysis.
Boy, that's a lot of different areas. So at Cetero, as both a full-service CRO as well as one that provides an integrated technology stack ranging from EDC, RTSM, CTMS, and more. We touch a lot of different areas, both inclusive and exclusive of AI. For me, I think the biggest area of focus has been recently on digital protocols, and specifically, how do you solve the problem of getting what is today still the standard of receiving PDFs or Word documents describing different areas of the trial, most specifically the protocol, and how do you turn that into a meaningful digital representation so that it can then be used by downstream systems and individuals to expedite their workflows.
Thank you. So if we kind of double click on that, what would you say are the top 3 challenges you faced in implementing AI within the eSource workflows? There's digital protocol, or the requirement of a digital protocol being one of them.
Is the question, what is the most challenging part of the kind of digital protocol portion? Is that the question?
Yeah, so would we say the top 3 challenges in general for AI? For implementing AI in Cetero and in StudyOS before that, you already touched on the need to digitize the protocol and to chunk it into pieces, but if you could kind of double click on what that challenge is, as well as any other challenges you find in this eSource workflow space.
I think one of the biggest challenges that I see is that AI is still really misunderstood by most people, even those who purportedly spend a lot of time trying to keep up with it. And by no fault of their own, there is a lot of marketing material that is very misleading about what AI is and how to use it. And I think that that's created somewhat of a challenge between the builders and the users of such systems. So for example, I think we talk about AI as if it's just this like homogenous single unified entity or product, when that's not really the case, right? I mean, you have large language model providers that people know about, and they're base models, and those can be used in all sorts of ways. And then you have these chat interfaces that have been slapped onto them, which have all sorts of different connectors to different underlying systems. And so people really conflate all of these different capabilities as one definitive thing. And I think one of the big challenges is that the way that people experience these chatbots is only one small and narrow view of the potential capabilities of these systems, and especially for those who know how to use them as kind of like an underlying component to a larger system. There's just so much more that they could do, but there's also just a lot more that they need to be aware of, right? There are a lot of pitfalls. It's, at the end of the day, another tool, another engineering challenge. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I see. The second thing is that there is this view, especially for those who are consuming materials, that it is magic. Basically, they are treating this as a binary yes, no. I have quote unquote adopted AI, and therefore I can expect to see these outcomes immediately. That's obviously farcical, but that's how a lot of people think about it. And I think that that's something that people should try to avoid, especially with their thinking, is yes, these are very impressive technologies that we are now using. But at the end of the day, they are still technologies. You're going to have all of the same problems that you did before with any other technology. So if we go back to moving to cloud, you're going to have to deal with things like change management. You're going to have to deal with internal education. You're going to have to deal with the fact that at the end of the day, a lot of these still have to be engineered solutions. So you need to think about how it works with your other systems. You need to think about how it works within workflows. All of these are still very relevant and pertinent questions, no matter the tool or the technology. And I feel like we are doing ourselves a disservice by pretending for some reason that in this particular instance that that's not the case. And then I think third biggest challenge, it's the difference between doing something right and doing something fast. And I think in this space, it's very easy to do things very fast. And I don't mean in clinical trials. That couldn't be further from the truth. Everything here is very slow. But what I mean is that there is obviously a very strong competitive pressure to release products, especially into the general public, as fast as you can, because everyone else is trying to put demos out there to show that they are ahead of everyone else. And I think it probably worked about 1.5 to 2 years ago. People were able to put out what I would consider very preliminary demos, that kind of proof of concept, showed what they could potentially do. But a lot of these people were also just white labeling pre-existing products. There wasn't really any actual IP being developed. And I think the industry is seeing past that now. But doing something well in production, where you have people relying on your systems to be accurate, relying on your systems to provide value, that's almost a whole different ballpark. It takes a lot of work. And so I think that that's probably the last challenge, is to make sure that you've set yourself up for success by making sure that you've considered how to make people successful with these kinds of AI products. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Maybe the last point on, just to add on to my last point there, when you're working with systems that provide what I would consider pretty differentiated capabilities that are pretty net new, there are different skills that your teams need to be aware of. The traditional, waterfall method of, product development, where you go through the design of the system and then you ultimately validate it, is still relevant and necessary. But AI systems in particular, often need things like evaluation and test harnesses, which are very unique to the development of AI products, which don't really exist in other situations. And that in and of itself is a net new skill that needs to be developed, which most people are unfamiliar with, and they tend to skip over it, even though I think it's a critical component to the overall delivery.
Okay, so that kind of gets us to our next question that I think is interesting. So, Ellis, you've worked both from the technology side and now inside of a CRO. So you've seen both the kind of the outside tech space looking in pharma, and then the pharma space looking out. And as AI becomes more and more integrated into these eSource workflows, have you and your team, or what types of specific AI training or upskilling or clinical training, depending on which side you're looking at, either the tech side looking at the clinical or the clinical side looking at the tech, what kinds of training and upskilling has your teams needed? And what has the experience been like? When has it worked? When has it not worked? Where have the challenges been?
I think the most important thing for these kinds of products is that you really need to allow people the flexibility to just try it out. I know that sounds counterintuitive because every leader has a very almost mechanistic and procedural way of looking at these kinds of things, where they want to have ROI, they want to have definitive outcomes, and these are all very valid. And I don't mean to dismiss that. You need to have that from any standard business management practice, of course. But it's also so very unknown to both the people who are buying the solutions as well as the people who are prospective users. And because of that, it's very difficult to go in ahead of time and say, okay, this is exactly what we're going to get out of it. And so training is super important, and I'll touch on that in a second, but just allowing people to explore the various products on the market in their own capacities. And, obviously you want to segregate that from any critical data, but allowing them to basically explore and understand what the potentials are, I think is really, really important for you to even consider adopting a solution like this. Because if at face value you don't know what you're doing, or you have no idea what the possibilities are, and you're relying on things that you've seen on the market, you're really limiting the scope of how it could improve your organization. And furthermore, it's difficult to train people when you yourself have basically zero idea how the systems work. I think it's really interesting because if you look at the use of a lot of the more kind of robust products, commercial off the shelf products today, a lot of times the first experience people will have is just pure astonishment. They'll be astounded by how knowledgeable the systems seem, how communicative, and how well they can kind of converse with these systems in a way that they've never been able to do so before. And it is super impressive, no doubt. And then it almost always takes anybody about, I don't know, a couple of weeks before they really start to realize, wait a second, there are limits to these systems, right? They have limited context. So after you talk for a certain period of time, suddenly there's just like catastrophic memory issues, or they can hallucinate. And, people often talk about hallucination as a system that's blatantly lying or misrepresenting. That was really common in older variants of LLMs. They've done a really good job with post-training out and various agentic techniques to, involve citing when responding. But even then, people often forget that when you're even conversing with a human, a lot of what we're doing is we are assuming a level of shared context in the conversation. For example, you and I, we have shared context about working in clinical trials or working in technology business. And so I can make a lot of assumptions about what you know and vice versa during this conversation. And so we don't have to rehash everything. But, obviously these systems, they're not human beings. They don't have that level of shared context. And so it's really easy for people to forget that they have to provide all of this information to get the responses that they want, or that what I would consider under-specified requests can give you under-specified or unexpected responses, right? It's pretty impressive that you can get pretty good responses given how vague a request can be. And I think people at first are really astounded by that. And then they realize that's actually not necessarily a good thing, because if you're very vague about what you want, you're going to get some kind of trash answer back. And then suddenly you realize, okay, well, if a user does that in a production system, how do we handle something like that? And so these are all the questions that people won't really understand at the beginning. And they really have to be able to use these commercial off-the-shelf systems at the beginning to learn. And especially if you are kind of a builder of such systems, you need to be able to put these in front of your own kind of users in very early test environments to get that kind of feedback. Going into training, I mean, it's kind of like having these conversations as well. I think a lot of it is about using them. It's a lot of it is about understanding the internals of these systems. I do think it's super important that people are demystified about how a lot of the products work. Internally, we've had certain discussions about, for example, how does a tool call work? And you know, for folks who are listening, they might say, "What the heck is a tool call?" And basically, at the end of the day, all of these systems work in an almost text in, text out format, right? So when it does a quote unquote web search, there is some portion of the text in, text out that says, I think I need to search the web. And then there's like a description of what a web search looks like. And then that's how basically they initiate the web search. And then there's obviously more programmatic portions that follow that. And then at the end of the day, though, everything is text. And that kind of seems both amazing that it works at all, but also once you realize that under the hood that's how it works, you can realize some of the failure modes and how certain under specifications can lead to certain outcomes, or how there can be security vulnerabilities if you don't have certain kinds of guardrails, and why these things are important. But all of that requires you to have some level of knowledge that is beyond the surface level.
Okay, so those are both two really good high-level examples of how AI works in this eSource space. Let's dig a little bit deeper into like a particular use case or case study where you've used AI or agentic AI. In your bio, you talk about Ash. Maybe you can explain how that was applied in an eSource project. What were some of the key challenges as you explored that technology over the last year or so, and then ultimately what worked and what didn't? Some of those lessons learned. So just let's maybe go from this very high level kind of here's generic technical problems to something really hands-on and specific.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned at the beginning, the most hands-on specific example of eSource that we work on internally is kind of the digitization of protocols, and I'm happy to talk about how that's been difficult to develop and what are some of the key technical challenges. Hopefully it's not too technical or too confusing for folks, but basically the biggest challenge with anything in this space is heterogeneity, right? Which is that trials can be very, very different from one another. Historical protocol documents can be very different from one another. And as we move into standardization, it makes a lot of these problems easier, but it doesn't completely remove the fact that a lot of these upstream documents are very different from one another. So I think one of the challenges with kind of doing protocol digitalization is that you have to target a common format. And so you have to basically at this point in time, it's going to be USDM. There's a couple of key challenges that I've seen personally with USDM and how that flows into underlying systems, or I guess like subsequent systems like EDC study builds and everything else. So the first problem is when you get the protocol document itself, these systems will basically never be 100% accurate. It's virtually impossible to do at this particular moment in time. And even if you were able to do it for a specific given set of protocols, again, you're always going to have edge cases, just like anything else where you're going to have some under specification. So you really need to be able to design the system in such a way that human users can come in, they can see different areas where, here for, let's say, like the inclusion exclusion criteria, the confidence score on extraction was X, but for this specific activity, it's a little bit less than that. And you need to be able to both specify where these error states happen, what the confidence levels are, and then allow them to kind of correct those errors before it ends up in a downstream system. So you really need to make sure that your review workflow has a user in mind. And I think that is not something people usually go out and think about when they're developing systems. It's oftentimes like engineers, they want to build something with the assumption that you go from like 0 to 1. There's no user step involved. You want to have it perfect from the get-go. That's just not applicable in a situation like this. And so having that kind of UX in the system is basically you have to have it. It's a non-starter without it. So I think that's one super big challenge is how do you set up the structure so that you're both leveraging the technology as much as you can, but also putting the person in control at the right moment in time where a lot of the work has been done, but you haven't really kind of hit the final step yet, and they can still review and make the changes without making those change portions be too burdensome. Because the last thing you want to do is say, here's a problem, let me restart the entire thing just because there was one issue, right? That's also silly. And so you need to be kind of thoughtful about how you design those systems. The second thing is, and this is going back to the whole builders versus users dichotomy, is that these commercial off-the-shelf tools are basically not going to be able to do these solve these problems for you. They'll get pretty close, don't get me wrong. I mean, you'll probably get maybe like 60% of the way there or something like that with just a one-shot tool off the internet, which is very impressive. Don't get me wrong, it's super impressive. But if you are in the business of making this part of your production workflow, that's not going to cut it. You actually do have to either get something specific from the industry, or you have to work with some specific organization who's going to build it internally for you, or you have to do it yourself, right? Basically, those are the three options. And then you have to get into the actual side of like, how do you, if you are building it, what kind of problems are you going to have? And I think specifically with protocol digitalization, there's a couple of key problems that you're going to have. So obviously one of them is heterogeneity, which I mentioned. Two is that not all models are equally good. So when I say model here, people often say something like ChatGPT or Anthropic or Claude or whatever else. Those aren't the models. The models are like the actual kind of like when you see a string like Gemini, Flash, or when you see, Claude, Sonnet, or those are the kind of names of the model. You can think of those as version numbers of a system, right? It's loosely how you might want to think about it. They're all better at different things. And so even inside of a protocol document, there are parts of the protocol that are just more difficult for systems to handle. They've all been trained on kind of different corpus of text. And so you'll find that certain systems are better at the vision portion, right? You'll find that certain systems are better at kind of what I'll consider large context self-referencing. So for example, they'll be able to understand that a footnote in one location refers to text at another location. And then others will be better at things like taking the text that's been extracted from a generic PDF extractor step and understanding that was part of an original tabular format. So they all have their different pros and cons. And what you'll find is that if you're trying to get up into the 95 plus percentile for accuracy, you need to be able to interleave the best of breed models at these different steps. And that's no easy task. It requires not just that, you've set up the infrastructure kind of contractually with all of these organizations and that you've kind of vetted them from a privacy and security perspective, and you understand what portions of what systems you're going to be using, but that you also have the test harnesses and evaluation framework set up to be able to do this over the long term. And those are all, not insubstantial amounts of work to be done. So I think I could keep going on, but those are some of the challenges that
some of the challenges face. Yeah. So let me jump to a slightly different topic, but related. So stepping away from strict eSource, SCDM is the Society of Clinical Data Management. How is AI in your organization being used for data cleaning or quality assurance, RBQM, data review, etc.? And if, so how are you doing it? What does it look like, and how is it working?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's really where our first product, you might call it Ash, was developed for, was really kind of the data cleaning and data review lifecycle. So we're focusing right now on a very particular set of problems internally. The system itself has been engineered to work in a kind of a broad variety of use cases, which I won't touch on. So I will just specifically focusing on the data review and data cleaning lifecycle. So I think if we had infinite time and infinite resources, such systems would not be useful, which sounds funny. But when you think about data cleaning and data review, we often, we'll start from something like edit checks, which we'll have inside of the EDC. And those are often, single form. You can have complex multi-form, but usually they're going to be, in the interest of time, kind of like templatized, standardized, single form checks. And then beyond that, you might have a couple of critical areas that you'll look into, and then you'll employ kind of a SAS programmer or some other kind of programmer to create listings for review. And that's pretty much kind of where it ends. And I think if we were all honest with ourselves, and if we had, thousands of SaaS programmers at our disposal, we would probably programmatically check everything so that we're not involving humans for every little nitty gritty detail. The challenge is that it's not realistic to do that. So that's kind of why we end up in these kind of listing review formats, is because we literally cannot program the universe of possible constraints on the business. And when I say constraints on the business or constraints on the study, I don't mean just what's inside the EDC. I mean everything from temporal checks that go across different systems that involve, statistical properties or analyses to inform things like risk, right? And so you can get quite complex with these, and so and everyone would ideally like to do all of these things, but they can't. And so one of the things that we developed internally was Ash, which was just the name of the agent that we developed, and it was basically a super specific agentic process for generating essentially like a intermediary coding artifact. So in this case, we're talking about the SQL programming language, although it could obviously be SAS or Python, which allows users to specify in natural language the kinds of checks that they want, and then to generate a coding artifact.
Can you give an example of what that check would look like? Just a very specific example.
Yeah, I mean,
like AEs.
Yeah, so you could use it to identify certain kinds or classes of AEs. Another common situation we use for is like a lot of times safety reviewers or internal sponsors want to understand if there's been a big change in a specific endpoint, which is pretty difficult to do in most systems. Another kind of example would be reconciliation flags, which then automatically run every single day against the lab. So there are a bunch of different situations.
So something like how many AEs occurred, which AEs are occurring between certain types of visits. So let's say, do you have certain kinds of serious AEs or certain classifications of AEs that occur in between particular visits? That's something that Ash can handle.
Yeah, that's a great example. Another one is kind of expanding the ability to do inclusion exclusion criteria. So for example, you could do classes of drugs. For example, you could do a confidence scoring on coding, and that would allow you to identify potential IE issues earlier on as the data is being entered, rather than waiting for like a week or a month before reviewing that kind of data. So those are great examples of them. And so I think at the end of the day, like what we've really done is we've basically taken the model of if we had 1,000 SAS programmers and then we gave people that power. And so far the uptake has been pretty good internally, and I'm really excited about this product. And the nice thing about the way we focus on it is, rather than rely on the AI alone, which, as I've kind of discussed, has all sorts of, potential issues, we use it to shortcut a process we're already familiar with, which is using deterministic, auditable, repeatable code to generate these outputs. And because we kind of use this underlying coding artifact, same as a SAS program, we're basically able to use this to but also inform things like dashboards. We can, turn it around and validate it.
So in English, in non-tech English, you're having the agent write SQL rather than having the agent give you the answer directly or give you a data set directly.
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
Yeah. Sorry, I just needed to translate the artifact word back into more clinical trial speak. So so you're able to then use this artifact to you can then reuse the SQL code in dashboards or other data checks or other systems, or as an ongoing check, not just as a one-time analysis.
Absolutely. You don't have to ask every single day as a human. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest jumps that people have is like, they use these chat interfaces and they assume, for example, I have to ask the same question every single day just to find out if there's a problem. It's like, no. Because we created the program, so to speak, it now gets to run every single day when the data changes. And I think the most important part is that it's validatable. So for example, I can say on a given day with the given inputs, we got these outputs, and this is how we came to this kind of listing, which is obviously extremely important for a field like ours, where this level of regulatory scrutiny is something that we'll have to deal with, and we have to be able to explain.
Okay, so thank you. Just as one last question as we wrap up, looking ahead, maybe at the conference in the fall, 6 months, a year, what challenges do you foresee in scaling AI across eSource, rather in technical, governance, workforce readiness, etc.?
I think governance and understanding are going to be the two key areas. It's not the technology. At the end of the day, right, if you have a competent team or, a competent partner, you'll be able to create something that will be transformative. Ultimately, the question is, do the people who are making the decisions understand the systems enough to be able to understand what they can or can't do and where they should be investing? And do they understand the systems enough to understand where it does need to be governed and where it doesn't? And I think a big thing I see is we can often over index on the wrong areas of risk. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that will prevent any real uptake of the technology, is just this over indexing on things that really are not the risk, and having basically no insight or knowledge or awareness of the things that are actually risks when it comes to adoption.
So what do you think, if you had to pick one big risk, what would it be that you think that we're not paying attention to right now? And then one thing you think we are focusing on too much?
I think people focus way too much on whether or not AI systems are going to, suck up all of the data and then use it to train on their like. It's just it's not realistic. Like, training requires, so much data that any single data point's really not going to affect anything, and there's really not that much value in like any specific one person's data. And frankly, we already trust, for example, cloud vendors to host all of the data that we have already. And if that were really the concern, your data would have already been gone, right? It's not in their best interest to do that. Okay. And they're not going to do that, just like Microsoft is not going to do that to the data you put in their storage blobs, right? So I think that we over-index a lot on that. And I think we under-index, frankly, on how we evaluate the efficacy and how we evaluate not just the efficacy, but the accuracy of the systems. I think you can get really good single-shot performance, but I think when you talk about making a system reliable over time, it's really difficult to do. And it's not something where you should buy it because you see a snazzy demo, but you should really understand, how are we going to deal with the failure modes? Because they're inevitable. As I said before, you do have to go through the process of, development, business requirements, specifications, all the way to validation. That doesn't change. But what does change is the fact that at the end of the day, there are parts of these systems that are literally non-deterministic, especially unless you're working with a vendor who has, a multi-million-dollar cluster running, which they assuredly don't, right? They're going to be using some kind of system which is most likely going to have some non-determinism baked into it. And so how they control that through evaluation and confidence scoring and all sorts of other techniques is important. And if you don't know how to ask those questions or have those conversations, you are not really in a position to be buying these systems for production use. And I think that's where people tend to under-index.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ellis. This has been a great conversation. I want to thank you for your time today and for sharing your AI and eSource journey. Please join us on Spotify for additional podcast episodes on AI and eSource, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for having me.